they had not played at all for just upon 100 years. A little later, when supper was over, the chaplain married them in the castle chapel, and in due course, attended by the courtiers in waiting, they retired to rest. They slept but little, however. The princess indeed had not much need of sleep, and as soon as morning came, the prince took his leave of her. He returned to the city and told his father, who was waiting with some anxiety for him. He thought that he had lost himself while hunting in the forest, but had obtained some black bread and cheese from a charcoal burner in whose hovel he had passed in the night. His royal father, being of an easy-going nature, believed the tale, but his mother was not so easily hoodwinked. She noticed that he now went hunting every day. She also noticed that he always had an excuse handy when he had slept 2 or 3 nights from home. She felt certain, therefore, that he had some love affair. 2 whole years passed since the marriage of the prince and princess, and during that time they had 2 children. The first, a daughter, was called Dawn, while the second, a boy, was named Day, because he seemed even more beautiful than his sister. Many a time the queen told her son that he ought to settle down in life. She tried in this way to make him confide in her, but he did not dare to trust her with his secret. Despite the affection which he bore her, he was afraid of his mother, for she came from a race of ogres, and the king had only married her for her wealth. It was whispered at the court that she had ogreish instincts, and that when little children were near her, she had the greatest difficulty in the world to keep herself from pouncing on them. No wonder the prince was reluctant to say a word. But at the end of 2 years the king died, and the prince found himself on the throne. He then made public announcement of his marriage, and went to state to fetch his royal consort from her castle. With her 2 children beside her, she made a triumphal entry into the capital and of her husband's realm. Some time afterwards, the king declared war on his neighbor, the Emperor Cantalabute. He appointed the queen mother as regent in his absence, and entrusted his wife and children to her care. He expected to be away at the war for a whole of the summer, and as soon as he was gone, the queen mother sent her daughter-in-law and the 2 children to a country mansion in the forest. This she did that she might be able to more easily gratify her horrible longings. A few days later she went there, and in the evening summoned the chief steward. "For my dinner tomorrow," she told him, "I will eat Little Dawn." "Oh, madam!" exclaimed the steward. "That is my will," said the queen, and she spoke in the tones of an ogre who longs for raw meat. "You will serve her with piquant sauce," she added. The poor man, seeing plainly that it was useless to trifle with an ogress, took his big knife and went up to Little Dawn's chamber. She was at that time 4 years old, and when she came running with a smile to greet him, flinging her arms around his neck and coaxing him to give her some sweets, he burst into tears and let the knife fall from his hand. Presently he went down to the yard behind the house and slaughtered a young lamb. For this he made so delicious a sauce that his mistress declared she had never eaten anything so good. At the same time the steward carried Little Dawn to his wife and bade the latter hide her in the quarters which they had below the yard. 8 days later the wicked queen summoned her steward again. "For my supper," she announced, "I will eat Little Day." The steward made no answer, being determined to trick her as he had done previously. He went in search of Little Day, whom he found with a tiny foil in his hand, making brave passes, though he was but 3 years old, at a big monkey. He carried him off to his wife, who stowed him away in hiding with Little Dawn. To the ogress the steward served up, in place of Day, a young goat so tender that she found it surpassingly delicious. So far, so good. But there came an evening when this evil queen again addressed the steward. "I have a mind," she said, "to eat the queen with the same sauce as you served with her children." This time the poor steward despaired of being able to practice another deception. The young queen was 20 years old, without counting the 100 years she had been asleep. Her skin, though white and beautiful, had become a little tough, and what animal could he possibly find that would correspond to her? He made up his mind that if he would save his own life he must kill the queen, and went upstairs to her apartment, determined to do the deed once and for all. Goading himself into a rage, he drew his knife and entered the young queen's chamber, but a reluctance to give her no moment of grace made him repeat respectfully the command which he had received from the queen-mother. "Do it! Do it!" she cried, baring her neck to him. "Carry out the order you have been given, then once more I shall see my children, my poor children that I loved so much." Nothing had been said to her when her children were stolen away, and she believed them to be dead. The poor steward was overcome by compassion. "No, no, madam," he declared, "you shall not die, but you shall certainly see your children again. That will be in my quarters, where I have hidden them. I shall make the queen eat a young hind in place of you, and thus trick her once more." Without more ado, he led her to his quarters, and leaving her there to embrace and weep over her children, proceeded to cook a hind with such art that the queen-mother ate it for her supper, with as much appetite as if it had indeed been the young queen. The queen-mother felt well satisfied with her cruel deeds, and planned to tell the king on his return that savage wolves had devoured his consort and his children. It was her habit, however, to prowl often about the courts and alleys of the mansion in the hope of scenting raw meat, and one evening she heard the little boy Day crying in a basement cellar. The child was weeping because his mother had threatened to whip him for some naughtiness, and she heard at the same time the voice of Dawn begging forgiveness for her brother. The ogress recognized the voices of the queen and her children, and was enraged to find that she had been tricked. The next morning, in tones so affrighting that all trembled, she ordered a huge vat to be brought into the middle of the courtyard. This she filled with vipers and toads, with snakes and serpents of every kind, intending to cast into it the queen and her children, and the steward with his wife and serving girl. By her command these were brought forward, and their hands tied behind their backs. There they were, and her minions were making ready to cast them into the vat, when into the courtyard rode the king. Nobody had expected him home so soon, but he had traveled post-haste. Filled with amazement, he demanded to know what this horrible spectacle meant. None dared tell him, and at that moment the ogress, enraged at what confronted her, threw herself head foremost into the vat, and was devoured on the instant by the hideous creatures she had placed in it. The king could not but be sorry, for after all she was his mother, but it was not long before he found ample consolation in his beautiful wife and children. The moral of the story: many a girl has waited long for a husband brave or strong, but I'm sure I never met any sort of woman yet who could wait 100 years, free from fretting, free from fears. Now our story seems to show that a century or so, late or early matters not, true love comes by fairy lot. Some old folk will even say it grows better by delay, yet this good advice, I fear, helps us neither there nor here. Though philosophers may prate how much wiser 'tis to wait, maids will be a sighing still, young blood must when young blood will.